So now we have the background to understand the methods of solar radiation modification that are most talked about. And the first one is what's called marine cloud brightening. And the idea of this came from some rather interesting satellite pictures over the oceans. And look at this picture here. What you can see is there's some thick cloud over here, and there's some thin cloud over here, but there's a whole bunch of stripes across this thin cloud of much brighter, more reflective clouds, and some more coming up like this. Very odd, what's going on? And this has been seen in many places. Here is a view of the coast off North America, and again you can see these white stripes all around the place. Again, they're not seen in the totally clear areas. They are seen in areas where there's already thin, low cloud. But what we're getting now is stripes of thicker cloud embedded in the thin, low cloud. So what's going on here? Well, it was realized that this is caused by pollution from cargo ships. Cargo ships burn particularly dirty forms of fuel, so-called bunker fuel, which contains lots of produces lots of sulfur dioxide and other pollutants, which get belched out. But that's not what we're seeing here. We're not seeing dark smoke, we're seeing white cloud. The idea is that, remember, the droplets only form when they've got nucleation points. And over the ocean there aren't that many nucleation grains. It mostly comes from chemicals produced by rotting seaweed. So if there's only a few of these nucleating condensation nuclei, these particles, the water just has to accumulate around them, which means you get a few large drops. Now in some ways this is good. This is what actually gets the pollution out of the atmosphere. These tiny this pollution particles form as water droplets, and then they get big enough they fall out of the sky and form rain. Though it is acid rain, so it can do damage to trees and things. But the idea is that when there's pollution belched out by some ship, that gives you a lot more of these condensation nuclei. And that means the water vapour has more grains to condense around, so you get less water around each grain. So instead of getting a few big drops, you get lots of small drops. And this is good for reflecting sunlight. First of all, as we talked about the square cube law, having a large amount of small drops just reflects more light for the same mass. And secondly, these small droplets stay in the air longer. They don't fall out as rain, which is bad in terms of washing the atmospheric pollution out of the air, but good in making thick clouds that can reflect sunlight. So that's thought to be what's going on here. What you've got is this is where a ship went, and the ship was belching out pollution, and the pollution drifted up into these thin clouds and helped the water condense. And so you get a lot more small water grains as opposed to just a few big water grains, which makes them appear much whiter and reflect more sunlight. So, well, we know this happens. Ships do this. It wasn't an intentional experiment, but it is an experiment. But does it actually cool things down? Well, it definitely blocks more sunlight, and all the atmospheric models say that blocking more sunlight from these low clouds should be quite effective at cooling the Earth down. But in fact, it's believed that there's so much, in certain parts of the world, there is lots and lots of ships. The North Atlantic is probably the busiest area. All the ships constantly going backwards and forwards across there have indeed created a lot of this extra cloud, because this sort of thin, low-altitude cloud is actually quite common over many of the world's oceans. And so it's believed that actually this has been keeping the North Atlantic cooled down, relative to what it would have been due to global warming. However, since I think 2016, there have been rules passed to reduce the amount of pollution put out by ships. And so what's actually happening is there are now fewer of these trails. Our natural experiment is over. And that has indeed caused the regions with lots of ships to heat up anomalously. So here is the June 2023 heat anomaly, which is how much the surface temperatures are different from their long-term average over this period. And you can see that the North Atlantic and a lot of the regions around here are way hotter than average. And this is thought, at least by some people, to be partially due to the lack of all this pollution from the ships, making more cloud to reflect the sunlight away. And this is responsible for some very nasty heat waves in Western Europe over this period. So as far as we can tell, this does work. We've not been doing it deliberately, we've been doing it by accident, simply because of pollution from ships. And as pollution from ships has gone down, it's actually heated up the ocean. So here's the idea. So naturally, over the ocean, you get about between 50 and 200 condensation nuclei per cubic centimetre, which is mostly ammonium sulfate particles produced from planktonic algae at the sea surface, apparently. I'm not an expert on planktonic algae. Now, if you could somehow squirt something non-toxic into the atmosphere and raise that to about 400 condensation nuclei per cubic centimetre, then that would mimic the effect of these ships and make the clouds thicker. Now, you don't want to be putting all the same horrible pollution into the atmosphere the ships were doing, because that has other bad effects like killing people and acid rain that destroys vegetation. So the idea is we'll probably just put salt water into the air. The water will evaporate, but the salt will remain behind as tiny grains, and salt is an excellent condensation nucleus. So the idea would be, I don't know, maybe have thousands of solar-powered or wave-powered ships or barges floating around the relevant parts of the ocean, using their solar power to squirt water in tiny droplets up into the atmosphere. Or maybe actually they just blow bubbles under the water, and then when the bubbles come to the surface they pop, and the pop also hurls tiny bits of salt water into the atmosphere. So no one's tried this. We have the natural experiment of the pollution from the ships, and that seemed to indicate it could work, but maybe it could work. And you could, in this way, at least recreate the cooling that the polluting ships were causing in the past without the pollution, and maybe by building more of these things, actually partially reverse global warming. Some estimates say that you'd require maybe 1,000 or 1,500 of these ships crisscrossing the oceans to cancel out a large chunk of the current global warming. I mean, that's going to be expensive, but 1,500 ships is a very tiny fraction of the world's existing fleet. It's a lot cheaper than rewiring the entire world.